The year was 1215. England was on the brink of collapse. Its King John, son of the legendary Henry II and brother of Richard the Lionheart, was among the most unpopular monarchs in English history. Throughout his reign, King John had suffered humiliation after humiliation. He lost almost all the Angevin territories in France, lands his ancestors had ruled for generations. His failed military campaigns drained the royal treasury, and his demands for ever-increasing taxes angered the barons. John's rule was marked by cruelty, distrust, and arbitrary decisions. He was accused of exploiting the law for personal gain, seizing property and punishing enemies without due process. In a desperate bid to maintain control, John antagonized the powerful English Church, resulting in his excommunication by Pope Innocent III. Isolated at home and abroad, John faced open rebellion from his barons, who demanded reforms to curb royal abuses. Finally, in June 1215, John was forced to meet the rebel barons at Runnymede. There he affixed his seal to a document that would become one of the most famous in world history, the Magna Carta. This great charter established for the first time the principle that the king was not above the law. It promised the protection of baronial rights, limits on taxation, and safeguards for justice. Yet John had no intention of keeping his word. As soon as he could, he appealed to the Pope to have the Magna Carta annulled. Civil war erupted, known as the First Barons' War. Amidst the chaos, some English barons even invited Prince Louis of France to invade and claim the English crown. But John's reign would not last much longer. In October 1216, while retreating from rebel forces across the marshlands of eastern England, John contracted dysentery. He died soon after at Newark Castle, leaving behind a broken kingdom and a 9-year-old heir. This is the story of Henry III of England, a king who inherited a kingdom in chaos and ruled for more than half a century through periods of instability, rebuilding, and conflict. Henry III of England was born on the 1st of October, 1207 at Winchester Castle, one of the principal royal fortresses of the time. He was the eldest surviving son of King John of England and his second wife, Isabella of Angoulême. His birth took place during one of the most troubled periods in English royal history. By the time Henry was born, his father's reign was already marked by crisis and failure. John had lost vast territories in France, including the important Duchy of Normandy, severely weakening the power of the English crown. His efforts to recover these losses led to heavy taxation and frequent disputes with the English barons, creating widespread resentment across the kingdom. Henry entered a world where the authority of the monarchy was under serious threat. His mother, Isabella, had been married to John in 1200 when she was very young, and their union had stirred controversy in both England and France. As queen, Isabella remained somewhat distant from the political conflicts surrounding her husband, focusing instead on her family. During Henry's infancy, the political climate in England continued to deteriorate. King John's relationship with the Church broke down entirely in 1209 when he was excommunicated by Pope Innocent III after a dispute over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Although John later reconciled with the Pope, his authority at home had already suffered severe damage. Henry's early childhood was spent in a kingdom on the brink of rebellion. The royal court, including Henry and his siblings, led a constantly moving life, traveling between castles for security. Unlike the stability enjoyed by many royal heirs in earlier generations, Henry grew up in an environment of uncertainty and danger. In 1215, when Henry was just 7 years old, King John faced the greatest challenge of his reign. Pressured by a group of rebel barons who were angry over his arbitrary rule and heavy-handed methods, John was forced to agree to the Magna Carta at Runnymede. The Magna Carta was intended to limit the king's powers and protect the rights of the barons, but John had no real intention of abiding by its terms. Within months, civil war broke out. The rebellion escalated when the barons invited Prince Louis of France, the son of King Philip II, to invade England and claim the throne. Louis landed with an army in 1216, and a significant portion of England, including London, came under his control. At this point, the English monarchy was in grave danger of collapse, and the future of Henry and his family hung in the balance. In October 1216, As John fled from his enemies across the marshy lands known as the Wash, he suffered a great loss when much of his royal treasure, including the crown jewels, was swallowed by the tides. Soon after, John fell seriously ill, probably from dysentery. On the 18th of October 1216, King John died at Newark Castle. Henry, at just 9 years old, became the new King of England. At the time of John's death, Henry's claim to the throne was extremely fragile. Prince Louis controlled much of southern England, and many barons had sworn loyalty to the French prince rather than the English boy king. Nevertheless, a group of John's remaining loyalists acted quickly to preserve the Plantagenet dynasty. Recognizing that a 9-year-old boy could not rule unaided, a regency was immediately established. William Marshal, the Earl of Pembroke, one of the most respected knights and statesmen in the kingdom, was appointed protector and regent. Alongside Marshal, Gualabicchieri, the papal legate in England, played a key role in supporting Henry's government. The Pope declared Henry a ward of the Church, further reinforcing the boy king's position. After Henry's hurried coronation at Gloucester, the new regency government faced the enormous task of saving the English monarchy from collapse. One of their first and most important steps was to reissue the Magna Carta. The reissuing of the charter was a strategic decision. By confirming the barons' rights and promising a return to lawful governance, the regency hoped to persuade those lords who had turned against King John to now support his young son Henry. The aim was to strike a balance between securing baronial loyalty and maintaining enough royal authority to govern effectively. At the time, England was still in the midst of the First Barons' War. Prince Louis of France controlled London and much of southeastern England, with the support of many rebel barons. Yet Henry's regents, particularly the seasoned and respected William Marshal, moved decisively. Marshal rallied loyal forces and sought to win back rebel-held territories through a mixture of negotiation and military strength. The turning point came in May 1217 at the Battle of Lincoln. William Marshal personally led the Royalist army against forces loyal to Prince Louis and the rebel barons. In a hard-fought battle, Marshal's forces stormed Lincoln Castle and captured many of the rebel leaders. Following Lincoln, the balance of power shifted rapidly. The French position weakened further when in August 1217, a French fleet attempting to bring reinforcements was intercepted and defeated at the Battle of Sandwich by English naval forces. With military defeat imminent and support among the English barons collapsing, Prince Louis agreed to peace terms. In September 1217, the Treaty of Lambeth, sometimes known as the Treaty of Kingston, was signed. Louis renounced any claim to the English throne, swore an oath of loyalty to Henry, and withdrew from England. In return, the rebels were granted amnesty, and their lands and titles were restored if they pledged loyalty to the king. With the conclusion of the war, England entered a period of fragile peace. The monarchy had been preserved, but it remained weak. Large areas of the country had suffered from years of conflict, castles had changed hands repeatedly, and royal finances were in a disastrous state. Henry's government, still led by his regents, now turned its attention to rebuilding royal authority. Marshal's leadership was crucial during these years. His reputation as a fair and honorable man helped bind the kingdom together. Unfortunately, his time in power was short. William Marshal died in May 1219, when Henry was still only 11 years old. After Marshal's death, a council of regents took over governance, led by figures such as Hubert de Burgh, the Justiciar of England, and Peter de Roche, the Bishop of Winchester. Throughout this period, Henry was kept largely in the background. While he was recognized as king, real decision-making remained in the hands of his council. Throughout his minority, Henry was carefully managed and educated to prepare for personal rule. In May 1220, a second, more formal coronation ceremony was held for Henry at Westminster Abbey. Finally, in 1227, at the age of 20, Henry III was declared to have reached his majority. He formally assumed full royal authority, ending the regency that had governed England on his behalf for more than a decade. However, while the political situation had stabilized, Henry's long minority had also created certain expectations among the English barons. Many of them had become accustomed to a style of government in which the king's powers were checked by councils and by consultation. They expected Henry to continue ruling in cooperation with the nobility, respecting the charters and the balance of power that had been painstakingly restored during his youth. After Henry's formally assumed full control of the English government, his first act as monarch in full power was to declare that all charters issued during his minority, including the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest, had been granted under compulsion. Nevertheless, he reissued them again, this time as a free act of royal grace rather than obligation. Though the move caused some unease among the barons, it did not spark open resistance. During the early years of his personal reign, Henry continued to rely heavily on his longtime advisor and justiciar, Hubert de Burgh. De Burgh had played a central role during the Regency, serving as a key administrator and military leader. He had helped restore royal control, and for a time he remained one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. However, Henry's increasing dependence on foreign courtiers and his growing personal confidence began to shift the balance of power at court. Henry's mother, Isabella of Angoulême, had returned to France and remarried into the Lusignan family. Over time, Henry invited many of his French half-brothers and Lusignan relatives to England. Their arrival caused deep resentment among the English nobility, who viewed them as outsiders competing for royal favor, wealth, and offices. Amidst this growing tension, Henry launched his first major foreign policy initiative in 1230. An expedition to France aimed at recovering the lands his father had lost decades earlier. The campaign, often referred to as the English invasion of France, was driven by Henry's long-standing desire to reassert Plantagenet control over Normandy and Anjou. In May 1230, Henry crossed the English Channel with a sizable army and landed at Saint-Malo in Brittany. However, the campaign was poorly managed from the start. Henry was indecisive and cautious, spending months in Brittany without launching any significant military offensive. Rather than attacking the heartlands of French royal power, he avoided major confrontations, hoping to build alliances and encourage local support. This strategy failed. The local nobility did not rally to his cause, and the French king Louis IX made no major mistakes. By October 1230, after achieving little and at great expense, Henry returned to England without having fought a single significant battle. The campaign was a costly failure. It damaged Henry's credibility and reinforced the view among many nobles that he lacked the military decisiveness of his grandfather Henry II, or even his father King John. The failed expedition also began to expose deeper cracks in the relationship between the king and his ministers. Hubert de Burgh, once Henry's most trusted advisor, now found himself increasingly isolated at court. The Lusignan faction, growing in influence, resented de Burgh's power and sought to remove him. By 1232, Henry, under pressure from his new favorites and frustrated by ongoing political tensions, turned against de Burgh. He was stripped of his offices, arrested and imprisoned. Though eventually released and allowed to live quietly, Hubert de Burgh's fall marked a dramatic shift in the king's inner circle. In de Burgh's place, Henry elevated Peter de Roche, Bishop of Winchester and an old figure from his regency, to a leading position in government. De Roche, along with his Poitevin allies from the continent, now dominated royal policy. Their rise to power alarmed many in the English aristocracy, who feared that the crown was increasingly under foreign influence. One of the most prominent critics of this new regime was Richard Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, and the younger brother of William Marshal. Richard was a respected noble, known for his integrity and his loyalty to the traditional customs of English governance. He and many others saw the growing dominance of foreign favorites as a betrayal of the principles that had stabilized the realm during Henry's minority. In 1233, Marshal openly rebelled against the king. The conflict, known as Richard Marshal's revolt, quickly escalated into armed clashes. Marshal gained support in both England and Ireland, where he held lands. The rebellion forced Henry into a difficult position. Although he remained loyal to his foreign allies, the rebellion spread wider than expected. In 1234, Richard Marshal was lured into a truce meeting in Ireland, only to be ambushed by men loyal to the king's justiciar in Ireland. Wounded in the skirmish, Richard died shortly afterward. His death caused widespread outrage and intensified pressure on Henry to change course. That same year, in April 1234, Archbishop Edmund of Abingdon intervened. Deeply concerned about the growing instability and the king's reliance on unpopular foreign advisors, he demanded the dismissal of Peter de Roche and the Poitevins as a condition for peace. Facing increasing opposition and fearing another civil conflict, Henry agreed. Des Roches was removed from power, and for a time, the influence of the foreign courtiers was curtailed. With Marshal's death and the removal of Des Roches, the immediate crisis ended. After the crisis of 1234, Henry III entered a new phase of his reign. He distanced himself from the Poitevin faction and governed more cautiously, relying on trusted English clerics and nobles. The leadership of Archbishop Edmund of Abingdon and Chancellor Ralph Neville brought a degree of moderation to royal policy. They worked to restore stability, maintain peaceful relations with the barons, and re-establish the authority of royal justice. In these years, Henry ruled with a more conciliatory tone, and England enjoyed a period of relative internal peace. But this balance would not last. As the 1230s gave way to the 1240s, Henry's personal tastes and priorities began to shape the character of his government more directly. One of the most defining features of Henry's middle reign was his deep religious devotion. He saw kingship as a sacred duty and considered himself appointed by God to serve as a Christian ruler. This devotion shaped much of his behavior and spending. Henry invested heavily in church building and religious art, most famously in the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. In 1245, he ordered the old Anglo-Saxon abbey to be replaced by a grand Gothic structure in the French style. The construction of the new Westminster Abbey would continue for decades and stand as one of the great legacies of Henry's reign. Religion also played a role in Henry's personal alliances. In 1236, he married Eleanor of Provence, a noblewoman from southern France. The marriage was arranged partly through ecclesiastical connections, and the Queen soon became a major influence at court. Eleanor was intelligent, well-educated, and politically astute. But her arrival also brought more foreign courtiers into Henry's inner circle, her Savoyard relatives and allies. Over time, these new arrivals were granted estates, titles, and offices. The barons once again grew resentful of the foreign influence at court. Many remembered the earlier troubles with the Lusignans and feared a repeat of that imbalance. Though Henry's intentions may have been personal rather than political, his generosity toward Eleanor's kin reignited tensions between the crown and the English aristocracy. The long-simmering frustration among the barons began to coalesce around a new figure: Simon de Montfort. Simon was a French-born nobleman who had inherited the earldom of Leicester through his English mother. Initially, he was a close ally of the king and had married Henry's sister Eleanor in 1238, with the king's approval. For a time, de Montfort was a central figure at court and even served as Henry's representative abroad. But Simon's growing influence and bold personality eventually brought him into conflict with the king. He was fiercely independent, deeply principled, and increasingly critical of the crown's financial mismanagement and favoritism. It was against this backdrop that a group of powerful barons, led by Simon de Montfort, confronted the king directly. At a parliament held in Oxford in June 1258, they forced Henry to accept a new set of reforms. These became known as the Provisions of Oxford. The provisions marked a turning point in English constitutional history. They required the king to rule with the advice of a council of 15 members, chosen partly by the barons. Henry agreed to the terms under pressure. The barons had overwhelming support, and the country was teetering on the edge of instability. But he never accepted the provisions in spirit. From the beginning, he worked quietly to reverse them. Over the next few years, England was ruled in a kind of uneasy dual authority. De Montfort and his allies attempted to implement reforms, reorganize royal finances, and curb the power of foreign courtiers. But divisions soon emerged among the reformers themselves. Meanwhile, Henry quietly appealed to Pope Urban IV, who annulled the provisions in 1261. With papal backing and growing support from conservative nobles, Henry declared the reforms invalid and reasserted his personal authority. This reignited tensions with the reform faction, and the kingdom once again moved toward civil war. By 1264, conflict was inevitable. the barons led by de Montfort took up arms against the king. This period of open warfare became known as the Second Barons' War. The decisive early moment came in May 1264 at the Battle of Lewes. Henry's forces faced de Montfort's smaller but well-prepared army in Sussex. Despite being outnumbered, de Montfort achieved a dramatic victory. The king was captured, and so was his son, Prince Edward. For more than a year after Lewes, de Montfort became the effective ruler of England. He governed in the king's name, but with his own council, attempting to uphold the principles of the Provisions of Oxford. Yet de Montfort's rule faced growing opposition. His authority, though gained through reform, increasingly appeared autocratic. Some former allies began to turn against him. Most crucially, Prince Edward escaped captivity in May 1265 and quickly rallied royalist forces. The final confrontation came in August 1265 at the Battle of Evesham. De Montfort, caught between royalist armies and with limited support, was defeated and killed in battle. His body was mutilated on the field, a brutal warning to others. With Evesham, Henry's personal authority was restored. After the death of Simon, Henry III regained control of his kingdom, but the years of civil war had taken their toll. Though restored as king, he returned to power a more cautious and subdued ruler. The period following Evesham was marked by the careful restoration of royal authority. Henry and his advisors, led increasingly by his son Prince Edward, sought to stabilize the realm and reconcile with former rebels. In 1266, a key step toward peace came in the form of the Dictum of Kenilworth, a royal decree that offered terms of pardon to those who had supported the rebellion. The rebels were required to pay fines proportional to their involvement in the conflict, but the policy was measured and designed to encourage reintegration rather than vengeance. Despite his return to power, Henry's role in government during these final years was limited. His health was declining, and his energy for active rule was fading. The true momentum of royal policy increasingly shifted to Prince Edward, who had shown military leadership and political judgment during the final phase of the conflict. Edward now emerged as the dominant figure at court. Tall, ambitious, and deeply aware of the failings of his father's reign, he began laying the groundwork for a more centralized and disciplined monarchy. In 1270, Prince Edward left England to join the Eighth Crusade, a decision that reflected both his religious convictions and his broader ambitions. With Edward abroad, Henry continued as king in name, but his health continued to decline. Finally, on the 16th of November, 1272, after 56 years on the throne, Henry III died at the Palace of Westminster. He was 65 years old. His body was buried in Westminster Abbey, near the shrine of his beloved Edward the Confessor, as he had long wished. His son, still returning from crusade, was proclaimed king without dispute. England had avoided another succession crisis, and the transition to Edward I marked the beginning of a very different kind of kingship.